Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course, Postmodernism in Literature. In the previous session, we started tracing the genealogy of postmodernism, and we also realized that there is an inability to understand and define and also trace genealogy of postmodernism unless we are sure of which kind of postmodernism one is tracing. And that also depends on the kind of modernism from which postmodernism departed or against which postmodernism is defined and located. So we began looking at the different kinds of modernisms, which also led to the emergence of different kinds of contrasting manifestations in the idea of the postmodern. So in today's session, we continue to locate this idea and we continue to develop this idea and to see how the genealogy can be located, or even when we cannot locate a particular kind of a genealogy. I begin by drawing your attention to one of the novels by Raymond Federman, and his work is published in 2001. His novel is entitled Aunt Rachel's Fur. So in this novel, which is also referred and quoted by Brian McHale in some of his works, in this novel, Raymond Federman has a protagonist who identifies himself as a postmodernist writer, and he approaches a particular producer and a publisher for his work and talks about how the novel perhaps does not fit into the current frameworks because it is postmodernist and that the postmodernist time has already gone and passed by. So Raymond Federman's character also makes this very succinct remark about the passage of postmodern times and also refers to the postmodern as a historic period which has already dead and gone by. So here I read out to you. We are already beyond postmodernism. It is dead. Dead and gone, don't you know? It's been buried. Where have you been? And that's precisely the problem for literature today. Now that postmodernism is dead, writers don't know how to replace it. The disappearance of postmodernism was devastating for the writers, but it was not surprising. It was expected to happen for some time. The last gasp happened the day Samuel Beckett changed tense, which was December 22nd, 1989. Samuel Beckett changed tense and joined the Angels. I can give you an exact date if you want to. Postmodernism died because Godot never came. So there are a number of references to the absurdist writer Samuel Beckett and his play Waiting for Godot, and also a very definitive categorical statement that postmodernism is dead and gone, to quote Raymond Federman. So when he tries to talk about postmodernism as a past phenomenon, it's also evident that if there is an end point, maybe there is a starting point as well. And if there is a way in which we can talk about postmodernism as a historic period which has already ended, maybe there are frameworks which would also allow us to locate the starting points and not just the ending points. And in that sense, let me also draw your attention to some of the previous ways in which historical periods have been located. When marking the arrival of modernism, Virginia Woolf wrote, on or about December 1910, human nature changed. All human relations have shifted, those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. When Virginia Woolf talks about December 1910, locating a particular time period in history for the arrival of modernism, one is not sure whether she is being really precise or whether she is employing the techniques of mock precision. Regardless of what she means, she also clarifies his position in the same passage where she says that it's not as if something spectacular suddenly happened. It's not as if she walked out of her room to see a flower blooming or a duck laying eggs, but she's drawing her attention, she's calling her attention to the unprecedented experience of newness undergone at least by some people in Europe and America before the Great World Wars. So here is a reference that Virginia Woolf makes to draw our attention to the general condition during the modernist period, which also significantly marks the arrival of modernism. And here we also may notice that she does not use the term modernism at all. This is in fact a construct, a creation in retrospect that other theorists and that other writers and theorists have coined. In that sense, when we talk about the end point of a particular period or the starting point of a particular period, there are ambiguities inherent. There are a lot of abstractions over there in spite of the ways in which we try to locate it at a particular date or a particular time period. No matter how vague it is, even if there are certain starting points available for the location or the beginning of modernism as a period, can we expect a similar kind of markers for the arrival of postmodernism? It's also a different matter that a number of philosophers and writers and theorists also hold this skeptical attitude and ask whether postmodernism has really arrived, whether we are really in the postmodern age or not. Let's not get into those more conflicting and more problematizing questions, but it would suffice perhaps at the outset to say that there are many starting points for postmodernism. Just like the beginnings of modernism were debated perhaps from the late 19th century until about the early 20th century. In the same way, there are many starting points that one could identify for the beginning of postmodernism. And we begin with some of the statements, some of the observations made by Charles Jencks, who is primarily an architect. In his work, What is Postmodernism?, which was published in 1986, he locates the beginning of postmodernism, or the beginning of postmodern architecture to be precise, with the moment of death of modern architecture. And interestingly, unlike the mock precision that Virginia Woolf employed by locating December 1910 as the moment of arrival of modernism, here we find Charles Jencks being more or less very seriously locating a very precise date, as precise as it can get, 15 July 1972 at 3:32 p.m. So is this kind of a precision possible or even viable? It's a different question that we need to engage with. But what prompted Charles Jencks to identify 15 July 1972, 3:32 p.m. as the moment which marked the end of modern architecture and also the birth of postmodern architecture? And this date significantly was the day when Pruitt-Igoe housing in St. Louis in America, which was a symbol of everything that went wrong in terms of modernist architecture, the modernist concepts of urban planning and housing, and it was demolished. And Jencks also argues in his work, What is Postmodernism?, that everything after this precise moment, after 15 July, that everything that happened in various societies and even in the minds of people, everything has become postmodernized. So according to Charles Jencks, this is a historical moment. There is no way in which one could go back from this moment, but everything post this moment has only one option, but to be postmodernized. So what was this Pruitt-Igoe housing project? This, in fact, even today in urban studies, this is considered as the icon of failure of urban renewal and of public policy planning. And this initially was a complex of 33 buildings put together, which was originally conceived as a public joint urban housing project. It was first occupied in 1954. But over a period, it only became, the number of occupants deteriorated. It was mostly unoccupied for a long time, and by the late 1960s, it also came to the attention of the authorities that this complex had only become internationally infamous for its poverty, the crime scene, and the racial segregation that it was promoting. So in 1972, at this precise moment that Jencks has identified, on 15 July 1972, the army was employed to completely demolish these buildings. So this image is also very symbolic of the total breakdown of the modernist project, and also the inability of the modernist project to achieve its goals through the various media of progress and technology that it initially had professed. So Jencks also in this context talks about everything being postmodernized, because he also believed that every single art object, every single cultural practice also was double-coded. And by that he meant that buildings and mostly artworks, architecture, artworks, everything had the power to appeal to two audiences simultaneously post this moment, post 1972. So the two audiences being, one, an audience of insiders who also know the nuances of particular art form or a particular kind of an architectural structure, who can appreciate it for the techniques and the kind of forms and the sort of structures which are being employed. And secondly, a popular audience who only know how to respond to a particular work on the basis of whether they are being entertained or not, whether they like it or not, whether that is suiting their sensibilities and their preferences and their attitudes in some form or the other. And one of the examples that we could cite could be the Disney animated films. We also know that in most of the Disney animated films, which are primarily meant for children, there we realize that the movie actually caters to two kinds of audiences. The first one being children, who are totally entertained to this use of slapstick and cuteness in those works, and also it appeals to the adults because there are a number of pop culture allusions and also a number of double entendres, a number of pun intended usages which would make it entertaining for the adults as well. So coming back to our task of locating a starting point, Charles Jencks was not the only one who identified a sort of a starting point for this moment of postmodernism. Andreas Gillen, a cultural historian, he disagreed with Charles Jencks and argued that Jencks is perhaps off by a year. And he mockingly made this argument that the demolition wasn't finally completed until 1973. So for Gillen, the year zero of postmodernism is 1973. So what makes 1973 as a more appropriate date for the beginning of postmodernism compared to 1972? And Andreas Gillen argues that this was the year which witnessed a cultural watershed in American culture and history in terms of architecture, in terms of cinema, and also Andy Warhol by this time emerges as a cultural institution. In fact, Andy Warhol was a leading figure in pop art in America, and he also popularized what's now known as silk screen paintings, and we realize that he becomes extremely successful and becomes a sort of a cultural icon, a cultural pop art icon by the 1970s. So in that sense, 1973 becomes important according to Andreas Gillen, and there are also a number of postmodernist literary landmarks which were published in 1973, a number of texts that we now consider as canon of postmodernism. Though canon is a very contested notion, so those sort of important works which are tagged with the label of postmodernism, such as Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, a series of novels, Crush, Great Jones Street, all of them were produced in 1973. So for Andreas Gillen, it's not 1972 but 1973 which could perhaps qualify as the starting point, the starting year of postmodernism. And Frederic Jameson also interestingly favors 1973, and he has he has a number of things to add to the list from the international history, from the international scene. He talks about the Middle East war which happens in 1973, the Arab oil boycott, the beginning of the unraveling of the Nixon administration, the Watergate scandal. So a number of things are identified in the year 1973, which Jameson believes that also signaled and marked the beginning of a new era, which is not modernist at all, but perhaps more postmodernist in nature. And Frederic Jameson, in his work Postmodernism, the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, he also argued that the Americans by 1973 also collectively experienced a rupture in their understanding of history, and they also entirely lost the ability to think historically due to a series of events happening not just within their nation but also in the international scene. Continuing with this much contested idea of locating a starting point, Brian McHale makes a very succinct argument at a later point in his 2008 essay entitled, in a very interesting way, 1966 Nervous Breakdown, or When Did Postmodernism Begin? So he identifies 1966 as the zero year of postmodernism. And he, in his essay, The Nervous Breakdown, or When Did Postmodernism Begin, he lists out a number of events and argues it out in an almost successful fashion that 1966 is better qualified to be the starting point of postmodernism vis-a-vis 1972 or even 1973. So to put it in a nutshell, McHale argues that a lot of avant-garde tendencies converged with popular culture in 1966. This was the beginning of a different kind of European art cinema, and also the emergence of American underground cinema. And there are a lot of countercultural fiction which gets published during this period. This is also the time of rock music, and also the consolidation and the self-conscious productions of Beatles also reaches its peak in 1966, and also a number of cultural products and practices which could be associated with America and also mostly the Western hemisphere. It could also be located in the year 1966, and also a number of key literary texts Brian McHale discusses in the context of postmodernism, and also the ones which were primarily published in 1966. So Brian McHale almost successfully argues that 1966 qualifies undoubtedly as the year when postmodernism began. But however, he ends his essay with this mocking note that he is only being as serious as Virginia Woolf was when she spoke about December 1910 being the year when human character changed. So he is saying, I'm not arguing for anything more or anything less. I'm only being as serious as Virginia Woolf was when she spoke about the arrival of modernism. So altogether, the point that I'm trying to highlight is that postmodernism has got many framings, and accordingly, there are many starting points. And it perhaps exists only as a category that we construct. There is no definite way of pinning down a starting point and saying postmodernism began then or now, but only a certain way in which we can look back at it and construct it in different ways possible. And there's also an uneven development associated with postmodernism. Unlike Charles Jencks, who believed that everything has become postmodernized, the current understanding is also that everything has not become evenly postmodernized. There are perhaps even many sites which continue to remain rather aloof from the idea of postmodernism for various reasons. It could be economic, it could be historic, it could be political. So there is an uneven development associated with postmodernism, regardless of the egalitarianism and regardless of the total rejection of the modernist elitism that it had brought about. And in this context, we also need to draw our attention to the fact that periods in cultural history or literary history are constituted retrospectively. So this is a point that we need to engage with in order to be able to also engage with this inability and the failure to locate a particular starting point for postmodernism. In terms of identifying postmodernism within a historical framework, we also need to ask this question whether literary and cultural history of postmodernism is even possible. As we have already noted, even in the discussion of three major theories that we have looked at, Jencks, Jameson and Brian McHale, there's only a possibility of a juxtaposition of events, and this is also fraught with discontinuity, heterogeneity and disruption. We cannot even focus on a single genre or a single kind of events to talk about the genealogy of postmodernism or to locate the starting points or to locate the trajectory. So in that sense, this leads us to this question whether a postmodern narration of culture or history is even viable or possible. It's also useful to remember that David Perkins, one of the leading theorists of literary historiography, he was also the author of the work Is Literary History Possible? And he in fact very categorically stated that narrative literary history cannot use the techniques of modernist and postmodernist fiction. That narrative literary history has to follow a more linear trajectory. Whether this is possible or not is perhaps a different question that we need to engage with, and we shall come back to this at a later point when we talk about history and historiography in the postmodernist period. In this context, it's perhaps useful to take a look at how literary and cultural periods were constructed during the modernist period. So how was modernism framed as a literary or historical period or as a cultural movement? And for this, we take a look at Harry Levin's essay, What is Modernism?, published in 1960. So in this essay, Levin undertakes a task to locate the history, to map the history of modernism. And he looks backward from the perspective of 1960 at the modernist writings of 1922. He chooses 1922 because there are very specific reasons for it. That was a year when James Joyce's Ulysses was published, Eliot's Wasteland, and also the performance of Brecht's first play was premiered, and Marcel Proust also died in the same year, 1922. And also there's almost a 40-year time lag between 1922 and 1960. So he chooses to look back at a period after 40 years. And when he does that, Levin is doing certain things also inadvertently. He is turning modernism into history. In that sense, modernism ceases to be now. Modernism ceases to be the contemporary. In 1960, he is looking back at a historical period. So in this process, modernism gets constructed, framed as a historical period with definite beginnings, a definite trajectory, and definite end. So he not only periodizes modernism, in that process, he ends up canonizing modernism as well. So how does he do it? There are two ways in which Levin approaches this period and frames it. Firstly, he locates it in the canon of literary historical periods. Yeah, and so in that sense, he has got a definite map, a route, a trajectory in place, where Romanticism followed Neoclassicism and Victorianism followed Romanticism, so on and so forth. So there is an already available framework within which he tries to situate modernism also as a continuity. So in this process, then through this process, he successfully locates modernism as a literary historical period. And secondly, the task is to identify the set of writers who deserve to belong to the canon of modernist literature. So there is a continuity that he builds in through the identification of particular literary historical periods and through the identification of particular writers or particular sites who deserve to be as part of the discussion. So in this essay, by looking at modernism, by looking back at modernism rather, Levin is not just trying to define modernism, but he is also trying to periodize and canonize modernism. So how is this different from whatever we are trying to do currently with postmodernism? With postmodernism, it's a totally different case. The modernists must have considered themselves as modern, which means new, but they never referred to themselves as modernists. The term they used for themselves, please note, was modern and not modernist. Modernist was a construction, a coinage which came in retrospectively. But on the contrary, the postmodernists are very, very conscious of their own identity as postmodernists. The postmodernism as a period is also conscious of its identity as a period. It is conscious of its historicity, conscious that this period, though we are perhaps even today living within this period, that it has a beginning and it can have an end. Whether the end has already come or not, that's a different question. But the very consciousness that one is living within a period which has already begun, which may soon end or has already ended, makes postmodernism a totally different category compared to modernism. To quote Brian McHale's words, postmodernism periodized itself. It did not wait for a Harry Levin to come over and look back at a later point and then periodize and canonize. This is perhaps the advantage and the greatest challenge that postmodernism poses before us. And Brian McHale also takes his arguments forward and says that perhaps in this transition, during this transition from the modern to the postmodern, maybe nothing new really entered the picture. Maybe only a reshuffling of the deck has taken place, a shift of the dominant. For example, Brian McHale talks about how what was backgrounded in modernism becomes foregrounded in postmodernism and vice versa. What was foregrounded in modernism becomes backgrounded in postmodernism. So maybe there are multiple reasons for this inability to historicize postmodernism, because it has already historicized itself, and there is an inability to look back at postmodernism because one is not too sure whether the period has already ended, whether there is sufficient time lag like the 40-year period that Levin had, whether there is a sufficient time lag that we now have to look back and periodize and canonize postmodernism. And so far we have only been talking about modernism, postmodernism, and the various characteristics and the various aspects of its genealogy and its framing, mostly in abstract terms. And Brian McHale becomes acutely conscious of this in his 2008 essay. He makes an attempt to engage with postmodernism in more concrete terms. And he also tries to illustrate through comparison. He talks about two major works: William Faulkner's Sound and the Fury, which is a typically modernist novel, and Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, which is a typical postmodernist novel. And both could be considered as canons from their respective periods. And Brian McHale undertakes a certain kind of an illustration to compare the modernist text with the postmodernist text. We begin looking at Faulkner's Sound and the Fury. Sound and the Fury makes use of interior monologues. In fact, each chapter could be considered as a monologue by a different character, including a character who's also mentally retarded. And there's also a dislocation of time. For example, the first chapter begins at one particular date, and the second chapter on the previous day, and another chapter in 1910, when Virginia Woolf also incidentally located the beginning of modernism. So there's a dislocation of time, and there are a number of interior monologues which totally challenges the aspect of readability, and also there is an engagement and experimentation with non-linear narration. So due to these various aspects, this text is also considered as a notoriously difficult text to read. And there are a number of references and secondary material available to access the text in the current scenario. And what this text entails is, what this text demands is to read between the lines, to fill in the gaps, to link up dispersed details, to solve puzzles, to distinguish solid clues from red herrings. This may begin to seem like the solving of a detective puzzle, which essentially it is, because there's also a crime scene involved in Sound and the Fury, which the readers are expected to eventually solve. So if this reads more like a detective novel, we cannot be blamed, because the modernist novel and detective novel, it had fairly coexisted, and some had even referred to the detective novel as a notorious twin brother of the modernist fiction. So here the only difference is that in this novel, in Sound and the Fury, even while the author Faulkner is presenting a series of such situations for the reader to decipher and for the reader to solve, the reader is emerging as a detective. The author is not providing any particular solutions. He is only giving clues to the reader to access the clues and to put them all together and then act like a detective. Here we also realize that there is a breakdown in the conception of the reader, in the conception of novel itself, because in the Victorian and the Romantic periods, in the previous periods, novel was also meant to be read for leisure. It was a pastime activity. It was about engaging in a less intellectual activity. So by the modernist period, this entire conception is being challenged. In the previous period, perhaps it was more about emotion. The novels appealed more to the emotion, more to the feelings. But in the modernist period, the reader had to be intellectually alive, intellectually aware, and intellectually connected with the various things being foregrounded in the text in order to make sense of the entire novel. So Sound and the Fury could be categorized as an epistemological novel, because it is about the difficulty of knowing anything for sure. The author does have a story in mind. The author only gives us certain clues, and this challenge of knowing, it lies with the reader. It's the reader's task to read and understand. If the reader cannot understand it, the author does not make any kind of intervention. So this, in that sense, is an epistemological novel, like most typical modernist novels are. It's about the difficulty of knowing. Now we come to Thomas Pynchon's work, Gravity's Rainbow. So this novel is set in the immediate aftermath of Second World War and the Cold War period. There are multiple quests for knowledge within this novel, within this plot narrative structure. There are particularly two which the novel deliberately foregrounds. One is a number of characters trying to find out what happened at the last launch of V2. This is during the Cold War period after the Second World War. And secondly, there is a storyline which revolves around an American lieutenant who's trying to find out what was done to him during his infancy when he was handed over to for a certain experiment to a behaviorist psychologist. So there are also others who are interested in knowing what happened to this American lieutenant during his infancy. So there are multiple characters in quest of different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of private and public knowledge. So here the difference is that In Faulkner's text, in Sound and the Fury, the detective was a reader. But in this text, the detective is not essentially the reader. The detective is also the object. It's the same character who is trying to understand about his own infancy and what happened to the series of events which happened then. So here, unlike the clues that the modernist text offers, there is a proliferation of alternatives and possibilities. There is ambiguity and uncertainty. There are also the presentation of secondary worlds and sub-worlds, and a totally inability to differentiate between differentiate one world from the other. We are also being introduced to a number of hallucinations and fantasies by the character. At some point, we even cease to understand whether we are inside the character's hallucination or whether whether the story is being narrated to us. And often, without knowing, we also participate in a number of events inside the text, such as movies which are being narrated within the text. There are staged performances. The reader sort of moves in and out of these various sites and various contexts, and there is an absolute difficulty in knowing which episodes might be fantasies and which could be real. So this is the epistemological challenge within which the reader operates. And here, in fact, what becomes more important is not the epistemological concerns. It's not about the challenges about knowing, but it's about the questions of ontology, that the challenges about being itself. So here we find that in Thomas Pynchon's work, by the time we reach the postmodernist narration, the quest for knowledge succumbed to the proliferation of worlds, and questions for epistemology and questions of epistemology succumb to questions of ontology. So for example, some of the ontological questions that would emerge in Pynchon's novel would be, which world is this? What is to be done in it? And which of my selves is to do it? So there are multiple levels of confusions and a plurality of experiences that are being presented to us, which makes this transition from the epistemological aspect to the ontological question, from modernism to postmodernism. I present this illustration to you because maybe the way ahead for us in trying to map questions of genealogy, the questions of understanding postmodernism, is also through a series of illustrations, also through by engaging with a series of texts like Brian McHale does. So when we try to map the genealogy of postmodernism, we're also trying to traverse through individual critiques and commentaries, mostly essays and articles, which we shall begin to do from next week's session onwards. And we also try to position the cultural and literary trends within a historical framework, within a certain definite principles, within certain definite framework, so that it's easy to present, it's easy to access. And we will also be doing a comparative analysis and literary criticism of various literary texts of fiction, prose fiction, and different other genres which are available to us. So as I wind up this session, where we began talking about the genealogy of postmodernism, where we started to locate the starting points of postmodernism and also engage with the various difficulties inherent in this task, we also wind up by reiterating that postmodernism is perhaps the only theoretical lens, the dominant theoretical lens available for us for cross-cultural readings. As the graphic guide to postmodernism would put it, this is the only theoretical framework which would connect Marilyn Monroe, Disney World, the Satanic Verses, and cyberspace in a same framework. So with this, we come to an end of this session. From the next section onwards, we shall begin looking at particular texts and trying to understand them within the framework of postmodernism. Thank you for listening and look forward to seeing you in the next sessions.